Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Spiritual Polyglot. I'm honored today to be joined by Richard Simcott. Richard Simcott is a renowned hyper polyglot who has studied over 50 languages. He co-founded the Polyglot Gathering, which is one of the largest and most prestigious annual events for polyglots and language enthusiasts. He has conducted numerous language workshops, both in person and online, where he shares his language learning techniques and strategies with others. These events and his general online presence have helped inspire and motivate countless individuals, including myself, to pursue their own language learning goals and dreams. You can find Richard at speakingfluently.com and all over social media. I will leave the links in the description box below. It is my absolute pleasure to have one of the OG polyglots as the very first guest on my podcast, Mr. Richard Simcott. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. What an introduction. I mean, I wish I had co-founded the Polyglot Gathering, though. Unfortunately, it is the Polyglot Conference that I
Oh
founded.
no.
But it doesn't matter because it's an extremely good event as well. The Polyglot Gathering, I definitely encourage anyone and everyone to join. It's an event that was a sister event that was sparked after the first Polyglot Conference. So for me, it's kind of an honor to be mistaken for, and it's a very, very common thing I'm mistaken for, as for being involved as an organizer or a founder of the Polyglot Gathering. In fact, it was my good friend Judith Meyer and her partner Chuck Smith who founded the event after they came to the first Polyglot conference in Budapest in 2013. And I was extremely happy to be able to support them and be there in person for the first event and for everyone since. I absolutely adore the Polyglot Gathering. So but thank you so much for a lovely introduction.
Thank you for clearing that up. Like, you don't know how long I've spent on that introduction, and I can't believe I've messed up on that. But that's a really interesting point because I didn't actually know the difference. I've not been to either. So that's
Mhm.
good that you've clarified the difference between them. And the 50 languages I spoke to just before we started recording this, that's an okay thing to say as well. You've
Well,
studied.
I mean, yeah, studied. I never say that I speak a certain number of languages just because I much prefer people to decide whether or not I speak the language. And if you decide I speak your language, then that's great. And if you decide I don't speak your language, well, that's okay too. I kind of just leave it up to people because definitions on language and fluency and what people speak and all these kinds of things are all very subjective. So I've over the years, I think, just got to a point where I'm whatever's fine.
How do you define fluency then? Like, at what point do you kind of allow yourself to think, I think I'm fluent in this language? Is there a point, like a certain level? Like, I've heard a lot of people say, like B2, you're pretty much fluent in everyday conversation, or would you have to be like at C1 level for yourself? Like, what do you classify as fluent? You've said it's very subjective, so what's
Mhm.
your subjective opinion?
Well, I think it really depends because fluency in itself actually just means an ability to speak in a fluid manner on a given topic, right? So people talk about fluency with very different ideas in mind. Now, in terms of my perception as how we feel when we're fluent, you could be speaking in a fluid and fluent manner from A to B1 on, really, if you feel confident. And particularly if you're speaking a language that's related to another language you speak even better, then you can definitely feel that your understanding is beyond that level, and therefore you can really get by quite nicely. And I think that really the key thing is, can you learn something through that language? And if you're at a point where you can use the language for learning, for development and growth, and you don't need to necessarily make recourse to another language, then one could argue that you're at that point a fluentish speaker in a language. It might not be the same for everyone. It may be less automatic that the words come out, but you may well have enough language there at that point to be able to make use of the language for everyday life. I think possibly for me, yeah, the B2 that you mentioned, for example, at that point you've covered all of the grammatical structures of a language. You've covered not just all of the daily normal things that you would talk about in daily life, but you've also gone way beyond that, because a B2 really you're ready to study at university in a language, and you've covered an awful lot of topics, and some of them quite in depth as well in terms of level of vocabulary. And so, yeah, I mean, there are certainly things where people ask for a C1, but I mean, it's a high level. C1 is something that's maybe looking at, teaching a language to children who are monolingual and teaching a subject through that language. And so therefore maybe a C1 might be required. That's definitely the case in places like Austria, where they will ask a teacher to have a C1 in German before they go and work in a school for many subjects.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad you mentioned that about B2. People underestimate the B2. Do you know? It's kind of a throwaway thing, like, oh, yeah, B2 in a language. And I guess because it's in that intermediate category, like technically, but for me, it's pretty advanced, right? I know a lot of native English speakers who, okay, maybe to part they would pass a B2 exam, but to get to the next level, like a C1, personally, I feel that the jump between B1 and B2 is massive. The
Mhm.
jump then between B2 and C1, maybe from the languages that I've studied, like slightly academically, because I'm not a huge fan of the language levels. We can talk about that if you want. Um, I've just found having to learn like a few more idioms, read a bit more, and that kind of gets you near enough to like the C1. I don't know what you think.
A lot of things to do with these exams and the levels we talk about, I think, is to do with learning how to pass an exam and
Yeah.
learning how to use language in very specific and particular situations. So, academic writing, academic presentations, definitely that tends to be a big focus of the C level exams. In terms of your general usage of the language, I mean, a B1 exam is nothing to sort of to sort of frown upon. For example, I mean, when I did my B1 exam for Turkish, I had to talk about military service in Turkey, and uh, it's we're not talking about saying what the day of the week is and the weather. I mean, even at A2, you're going into more detail than that. A1 is really, this very basic thing that people imagine of, you cover the first three main tenses, typically like past, present, and future. At A1 level, you would talk about all of the sort of normal everyday things that you would discuss, like food, likes, dislikes, plans, about your family, about your jobs, about your studies, about the weather, days of the week, months of the year, birthdays, and all that kind of stuff. That's all A1. And then when you start moving beyond that, you get longer texts even at A2. And I do feel sometimes that, yeah, people even, you say about people underestimating B2, I find that people very much underestimate A2. And, you hear these kinds of sort of talks about, oh, I did A1 and A2 in a week. And well, no, because it actually takes quite a long time to get through all of the material. Even if you're familiar with a similar language, just the amount of vocabulary that you have to cover is actually quite a lot.
That leads me into a question I've been wanting to ask you. How do you respond when people ask, how long does it take to learn a language? Like, do you have like a go-to response? Because for me, I'm like, well, how long have I got to answer this question, right? Like, there are
Yeah.
so many variables. How do you answer that when someone says, oh, you speak so many languages? I want to learn a language too. How long does it take?
So the answer is not very simple. I mean, you can talk about hours of learning a language, which is what people typically discuss in kind of, you hear about these sort of A1, A2, how many hours of tuition and self-study do you need to go for? So for Turkish, for example, it was 72 hours of tuition of Turkish for A1. And then on top of that, I did an intensive 3-month course in Turkish to get to A1. And on top of that, I had to do around 20 hours of study a week. That was kind of what was expected. So that's a lot of hours to get to an A1 level. If you do it in 3 months, yes, it's possible. But, and this is where the big kind of but comes in, if you do something intensively and you don't then use it quickly, and you don't carry on using it continually over a long period of time, it's amazing how quickly it can recede right back, and you only remember the very basics again. The slowly catch a monkey really does come into its own with language learning, because it's the repetition and seeing things over and over again that is really important over a longer period of time for it to become part of your long-term memory and something that you can use automatically. Now, I always go back to a phrase that I heard about or read many years ago, which was language learning is overlearning. And what that means is that you learn to the point that it just becomes automatic and you're not really thinking about it anymore. It just comes out of your mouth. And that's the only thing you get really with a lot of input and a lot of practice using it. And that takes time. So you can kind of rush it, and people will talk about how many months, how many years. Well, it depends. So if you learn one language very quickly over a period of a year, and then you continue to use that language very often on over a longer term, sort of on, for work or for life in general, then there's a good chance that you'll retain that quick learning to the higher, the level that you've achieved in that year of intensive learning. If you do it over a longer period of time and it just takes longer to learn, because you're not going to have that intensive period of practice over a longer period of time either, it makes sense to take it slowly. I mean, what's the rush, right? So, for me to get to a level where I was able to talk, reasonably well and to use it professionally and for my studies in German, I did it over a very intensive period of study and then continually used it in that way. When I look at Cornish, I've been doing it for 3 years and I've got to maybe a B1 level after 3 years, roughly. And I only use it, 4 or 5 times a week, maybe max. So it really is something that you have to agree with yourself. Okay, how often am I going to use it? How much time have I got to dedicate to it? And what can I reasonably cycle through in terms of language to retain that knowledge in my head?
You mentioned that so you practice Cornish, or you get to use it, what, 3, 4 times a week?
Yeah.
So you said only. For me, I'm like, that's a lot. Do you know?
Okay.
That's you raise the bar so much. 3 or 4 times a week, and that's using it like speaking to friends or
Yeah, so there are
just.
groups, groups of like language groups with Cornish, and we get together and we talk about different topics and practice the language. And yeah, that's about 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours a week of practice, just practicing Cornish, and then there's lessons on top of that to study the language.
Okay, okay. So
So I
it's
mean, if you think of maybe for 3 years, I've done possibly a 5, 6, 7 hours maybe a week minimum over 3 years to get to B1.
Okay, okay. So it's a few hours a week for Cornish, and then the other, because I guess that's a language you would classify as you're actively learning
Yeah.
still. And I know we don't stop learning any language, right? Because the level's just infinite. But is that one of the languages you're kind of studying at the moment? How do you decide, like, how do you cycle the languages of like, okay, I'm studying Cornish, German, or how do you like, do you group them and like learn language groups together, like study and then rotate them? How do you do that?
No. So basically what I do is I take on language projects. Some language projects will be a few months to look into a language, to study the language, see how it works, get under this kind of the bonnet, under the skin of the language, and see how the grammar works, how the vocabulary works, how it relates to other languages, whether they're related languages within a family or whether they are related in terms of geographically which language families they've mixed with. So some languages that are unrelated, like Hungarian, for example, will have influences from other languages because of the history of the country. And so you get into how German has influenced Hungarian, or how the Slavic languages have influenced Hungarian. And you can do that then sort of with many other languages as well. And even if they're not related, there's kind of things that you can learn from those relationships and the history involved. So do I go through all of my languages all the time? No, absolutely not, because I'd go completely crazy if I did that. And I have to sleep and eat, and I have to lead a life. I have to actually do things. So no, I get to a point where sometimes languages will often become just part of my life, whether it's for work or for pleasure, with friends, with family, whatever. And those languages I don't necessarily study because I'm using them actively. And so I don't feel the need to be actively doing anything with them apart from what I actively do naturally. There are other languages that maybe I'll dip into because I just enjoy dipping into them, whether it's listening to music, I read things online or listen to things online, or I may just dive into a book or whatever I do. And I might just do that randomly. But then there are languages that I'll study actively as a part of a language learning project. So at the moment, yeah, Cornish I started because it was on offer. I didn't know how long I was going to take with it. I started a number of languages during COVID that came online as courses that I didn't have access to before COVID. And this Cornish language course came up, and I decided to sign up for it and do a year and see how it was. It's a sister language of Welsh, which is one of the languages I speak. It's my heritage language. And so I decided it would be fun. I was going to do it with a friend. So we started learning together. And I just got into it and got to meet lots of other people through it. And since then, I've just carried on. And I did the first level exam, the first grade of Cornish exam. I did that and then signed up for grade 2, did the grade 2 exam, signed up for grade 3, did the grade 3 exam this summer. And now I've started grade 4, which is the final grade that you can do. And we have to do two sets of exams, one for literature and one for language. And so I just carry on. I'll just carry on with Cornish until I reach the end of that. And then I'll carry on just using it with people, with the friends that I've met. So there's that. Then there are languages that I'll just do for a few months and then I'll agree to leave it. So for example, Finnish, I studied for 3 months, studied for a month on my own and completed one of the books that you could do. And then I jumped into a university course in Helsinki. And I did 2 months at the university in Helsinki and studied another couple of books of Finnish. So officially I got to around about between an A2 and a B1 in Finnish, roughly. So I could function to a basic degree in Finland, but I spoke a very bookish Finnish. I didn't particularly learn the very colloquial way of speaking because Finland has this diglossia where they speak one way on the streets and a completely different way in books and on the news. And it felt good, but then I came back to the Balkans and no one speaks Finnish around me. It would take an awful lot of effort to keep it up. And so I just let it slip. And if I hear it now and I see it, it doesn't look completely weird to me anymore. And I remember bits about the grammar and the vocabulary that I'd learned. But can I reproduce the language now to the level I had when I was in Finland? Absolutely not. Am I worried about that? Also, absolutely not. Because it's not really realistic to retain all of these languages all the way through. You almost have to enjoy the kind of the journey of discovery, kind of like if you read a book and you remember the vague story of the book, or if you learn about history and you don't remember all of the details, but you remember generally what happened. And it helps you to kind of fit it into the bigger picture of a jigsaw puzzle that you're creating. You've put together the bits of the jigsaw puzzle in one corner and you remember how it looks, and then you're kind of creating this thing. And that's kind of what I'm doing with languages.
I kind of had a feeling that's what you were doing, with them. And I get them for a feel, and that's a nice analogy you've used. I like how like a jigsaw puzzle. I mean, okay, right, what is this? Like, what's the? It's like tasting the flavors of languages. Taste the flavor of Finnish. Okay, you can taste it. You kind of remember what it's like, but you're not going to
Yeah.
go back and eat it all the time. And mm,
No, and it's fine to do that. And there are certain languages or language families that I've definitely taken a much deeper dive into. So, I mean, my speciality language of families are the Romance, the Germanic, and the Slavic languages, which, because I've lived in those countries, studied in those countries, worked in those countries where those languages are spoken, and that's where my degree is from as well. I mean, I did my degree in French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, and then I also studied and lived and worked in Germany, and I lived in Czech Republic, and I did an advanced diploma at Charles University, and then I've been based in the Balkans for like almost half my life now at this point. And so you do get to a point where you focus in on the languages that are the ones that you're most sort of using most in your life. And for me, that's been those three groups. Obviously, Celtic languages, since the pandemic, I've got more into. I've been studying Irish, Scottish Gaelic, and Cornish. And then also with Welsh, it helps to kind of give me a nicer view of the Celtic languages. But I mean, there are other languages that I definitely feel quite at home speaking, but I don't need to be an expert in them. There are plenty of people who do that, and I don't need to try and do everything that everybody else in the world does. There's no why. If the languages intersect nicely with what I do and what I enjoy and the languages I know, it's really nice because it enriches all of the knowledge that I have in these languages. So my Turkish enriches my Macedonian, Bulgarian, Albanian, and the other languages, even Greek, that intersect, you know, because of the Ottoman Empire, and you learn so much from how that works. And then learning Ladino, which is this Judeo-Spanish, and how that came into this region, and how it developed because of the influences of these languages. It kind of takes you on this weird journey, because obviously Turkish itself is influenced by Persian and Arabic, and so they all really interconnect. There's no learning of one language and thinking that that's kind of it. That's just the way it is. The jigsaw puzzle doesn't stop at the bit you've done. There is always a bit that interlinks into the next bit. And so we don't live in a vacuum. And that's why I kind of just go on this journey of studying these languages and enjoying what, you know, the journey that it is.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a beautiful way of thinking about it. Like jigsaw, I love that. How do you not mix the languages? I know you're gonna say like it doesn't matter if I mix them anyway, but like what I advise my clients to do, my students to do, is to create a character in a
Mhm.
language. Is this something you do? Do you, maybe you're not conscious of it? Do you like create a character? So like when you speak French, for example,
Mhm.
is it you, Richard, that's speaking to me now in English that speaks, or is it a French version of you, if that makes sense?
um, I mean, this kind of goes down to the personality type question, I guess. Um, so I am me in all of my languages. I can't. I mean, I am an island ape from the United Kingdom, and I cannot lose that stupid British sense of humor. What I find funny is what I find funny, and I can't stop it. I mean, there's no you can take the ape off the island, but you can't take the island out of the ape. Is kind of my way of thinking. So I'm still me. But, and this is the big but as well with this, how you view me as a speaker of any of those different languages will be different because of your cultural lens and the way that you perceive my behavior and my word choice and the way I conduct myself as an island ape through your language. Because that will also be my flavoring of the words as well will be different. So, for example, um, a word like flora, for example, in English, we don't use that word that often. We associate it with certain things, right? But because that word in other languages like una flor in Spanish is used more on a daily basis, and it's connected to a very obvious type of thing that you visualize. And in English, it isn't. It's kind of a bit more floral. It's a bit more kind of in the air in terms of a concept, right? So those associations that I have because I'm an English speaker are not going to go away magically overnight, because I've even learned a language to a very high level. And I can, in a way, emulate the feelings that someone might have as a speaker of another language, but it's never going to be 100% the same. And I'm always going to have my own flavor to it because of my own, not just my own language, but my own dialect or my own idiolect. And so I always talk about myself as speaking Richard Simcottese, and I kind of speak that in a different version depending on the words that come out of my mouth, the language and the grammar that I have associated with it. And so how well I express my version of me in a language is dependent on your cultural lens and your linguistic associations, but also my own. And so the different feelings that I think people perceive when they say about a different personality or a different thing comes out is exactly that. It's the perceptions of themselves and the perceptions that other people have, more than a real change in your personality. I think it's a channeling of personality, and I think it's a viewing of the facets, the sides of you as a person, because there are certain facets of your personality that I will see in this interview that I might not see in other places, or things about you that I won't see in this interview that I would see in other contexts, for example. And so that happens as well when you're in a different country and you're speaking a different language. Not all of the sides of your personality come out all of the time.
Mm. Okay, great answer. So it sounds like your personality remains the same, but it's kind of like channeled through a different persona. Would that be
Yeah, I
accurate?
guess. And I mean, and certainly there are kind of things that you would tend to say because you develop your own idiolect in a language as well. So there are certain things that I would say typically in English or in my original dialect of English, Scouse, I would say in Scouse, but I wouldn't say to you as somebody who's not a speaker of Scouse.
You're a Scouser.
Yeah.
I had no idea. Have you, how long has it been since you kind of your accent has it like become I wouldn't say it's received pronunciation, but it's a lot closer to my kind of English, like in the south of England.
So the only thing that I guess, as a southerner, you would hear me say the northern vowels. So I would say grass, I would say glass. I'm not going to say glass and grass. But what I do, for example, I mean, if I were to talk to you in like the original way I used to speak, it'd be more like that. So it's totally different, you know. And that's Scouse English. But then if you to speak in dialect, then that would be different again, because obviously there's different grammar that goes with the dialect. But even within English, I'm going to adapt my English to my audience, right? So if I'm speaking to an American speaker of English, I'm not going to speak to an American English speaker in the same way as I'd speak to you, because there are certain words and turns of phrase that I know they're not going to know. So I'm going to avoid them. And does that mean that I'm changing my personality or changing the way I am or who I am? Not necessarily. I'm just using different sides of
Mm.
who I am to fit in and to make myself more palatable to a new audience. And I think that's a natural thing that we do, the same way as you would do it within the context of going to school, going for a job interview versus going out with your friends to the pub or to the park as a kid. You know, how you behave in different or at home, even with family, right? Or with your dog or with your cat. You speak differently in different places. And it's not you pretending, it's not you being a different person, it's just a different facet, a different side of who you are.
Mm.
So me speaking the way I'm speaking now is just another way that I developed in my communication style to speak to a different audience. And then
Mm.
how I speak if I'm back in Merseyside or how I speak in North Wales is going to be different.
Yeah, yeah. So you kind of revert back when you go back there, and
Yeah, I mean, but I mean, the way I speak is the way I speak, and I'm so used to speaking this way that you know, it's a natural development. It's not something that I put on. It's not like, you know, all of a sudden I start speaking like this to you, darling, and it's very different.
It's quite affected, you see. And I don't speak in this manner in any context whatsoever. So, it's not going to happen. But the way I'm speaking now is not as affected. It's not an accent I'm putting on.
I see, I see. And I'd love to know if there are any like phrases or expressions. We're talking about learning different languages, right? You kind of learn a different language, you almost discover a different side to you that wasn't accessible, right? When you just speak in English, for the monolingual guys out there. When you learn another language, you suddenly become aware of phrases and cultural expressions that just don't translate back into
Mm-hmm.
English. Have you got any standout ones for you that come to mind when I say that? Like, oh yeah, I wish there was an expression for this in English, or
I'm trying to think of an example of something that
yeah,
doesn't
sorry, I put
exist
you
at
on the spot
all.
there. It's one of those things that you'll have so many like, and when you realize them in the moment, you've got it. But
Yeah, there are certain expressions, for example, that so there's one that we use, for example, in Macedonian. It's not an expression per se, it's a word. So to refer to small children, there is an expression in American English, but not in British English, in my original English. And the word in Macedonian is junjule, and
Junjole.
and it literally means a marigold. It's one of the words for a marigold, the flower, a marigold.
Okay.
But you use it also to refer to a small child, and it's kind of like, typical sort of little kid, and it's a funny word, and it's got quite a lot of weight to it, and it's got quite a lot of feeling attached to it in Macedonian. But in English, really, I think the translation would be rugrat,
Hmm.
and but it's an Americanism, right? It's not from the UK, and I don't know a UK version of rugrat that we use typically. But this word kind of refers to that, and that's just one. I mean, there are definitely other things. There are definitely words and concepts that don't exist. Um, One of the things that surprises me a lot is sort of the associations that you have with certain words, right? So when you're trying to find a variation of a word, what the root of that word will be related to in another language will be different to, say, English or another word. Um, words like science in English. Science doesn't really mean very much of anything to an average English speaker. It's just a word for science, right? But it's not related to anything. Whereas Wissenschaft in German, as soon as you say that word, Wissen is like it means knowledge. Or everyone knows that Wissen is like to know things, right? And science means that, but it's so lost because of the sort of where it's come from and its roots and its origins. It's lost in English. Other words like medical terminology in English, you've got pneumonia. Well, you have to learn the idea of pneumonia as a concept in English and what it means. But if you know the German word for it, Lungenentzündung, it's it's really obvious because it means an inflammation of the lung, and it's very obvious to a German speaker what that means. And it's much more visual than pneumonia in English. So there are things like that that I always find really, really curious, because not only is this sort of linguistic exploration of various parts of the world a thing that really helps you expand your linguistic knowledge, but it also gives you a much more visual idea of certain things within science or history, or feelings attached to certain words, or even insights into your own language. I mean, I remember I was on a course for Turkish, and I think it was at the B1 level, and it was this expression for someone to be very, very beautiful, and it was trying to think what the word was in Turkish. It's now I'm thinking of it. It's escaped me. Um, what's the word? It's absolutely escaped me. It
That's
may
all right.
come back. It may come back, but this word doesn't exist in English as its own, as like it's a translation. It's the actual word in English is the same word as in Turkish, and I'd never heard of it before. Um, uh, Hürriye gibi, hürriye gibi bir insan. So basically, this word in English is hürriye, and I'd never heard it in English.
Say it again. Hurriya.
Hürriye, yeah. So it's like a type of like sprite nymph, this type of sort of almost majestic type creature.
Okay.
And but it's an Arabic origin word, and it's used in English in the dictionary. It just comes out the same word as the Turkish word, but this is kind of a more commonly known word in Turkish, and in English you knew it. But I mean, even to the point that when I try and think of it, when I'm trying to think of the English, I can't. So it's one of those things that you discover kind of almost mythologies, you know, sort of science, geographical things, you know, when you learn Greek and then you hear, you know, California and you, oh, Cali, so it's linked to calligraphy. And you think, well, you don't learn these things at school, and you don't learn them even growing up. But then you start to hear these words and you think, I never put those things together. California being linked to calligraphy. And when you start discovering this kind of link because of the language learning, that's where I think it gets really exciting.
Yeah.
Do they become translatable? Not always.
Yeah, but it's okay. It doesn't. That's where the magic is, isn't it? Like, there's not a direct translation for everything. And when I learn words, I try to almost like energetically feel into the word, you know, before translating it back into my native language, back into English. I'll try to like feel into it. Okay, you get the context right, and you kind of feel, what does this feel like? And then you try and guess and match it with words. And sometimes there's no match. Sometimes it just hits the spot so well. Like tener ganas in Spanish is an obvious example, right? Like, and everyone I know who's like learned Spanish as an English person, we end up using ganas just in normal speak when we speak to one another. Obviously, with other English people, you can't use it; they'd look at it a bit strange. But you just say, "Oh man, I don't have the ganas." You know, it's just such a good word. We don't have a word like that in English, and that's where the magic is, I think.
Es la leche.
Yeah, la leche. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
There's a lot to
they
unpick
have
with
some
that,
great
isn't
expressions.
there?
Yeah, we could do a whole podcast on Spanish and expressions and whatnot. But yeah, where did you learn your Spanish? And with Spanish, did you choose a dialect, or is there such thing as like general Spanish? Because for me, there isn't. I think you can start off with general Spanish, but then, I mean, I learned in Spain, so my choice was kind of already made for me, right? But with your Spanish, do you kind of, can you adapt it like you adapt your English when you speak to English speakers? Can you speak like South American Spanish or a bit of like Mexican Spanish? So the Mexicans change it to like Castellano when you speak to someone from Madrid.
So I can play with accents and dialects a little bit in French, Spanish, German, and um, and maybe a couple of other languages, but to a degree. And does it feel authentic? As for example, in English, it's a lot easier for me to do it, obviously, because you know I grew up around lots of different accents. So for me to speak in a Welsh accent or a Scottish accent or whatever is a lot easier. But yes, I can do it to a degree. Do I do it? No. Did I pick a dialect or accent? No. I tend to find that they pick you if they're going to pick you. So with Spanish in particular, my teacher at school, I learned Spanish at school and at university, and my teacher was from Madrid, and then my teachers at university were from all over the place, Gibraltar, Chile, and you know, you name it. And they were from all different places. And then when I went to university in France, strangely enough, I lived with people from Malaga, a couple of Malagueño, and then one girl from Galicia. And because the majority were Andalus speakers, that's what stuck most. So I used to be able to imitate a bit of a Galician accent in Spanish because of my friend from Galicia. But the one that felt most natural to me was more of an Andalus pronunciation, and that kind of stayed. And by the end of my year abroad in France, I ended up going to Malaga to the university, and it kind of just cemented that way of speaking. But then afterwards, I was working and studying a lot with people from South America, and particularly like Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and then I also had family. One of my stepbrother married into a Venezuelan family, so I had family in Venezuela. So I would hear lots of different types of Spanish, and so it kind of just merged into this whatever it was, and it tends to go back to its sort of point. The pendulum tends to stop back into kind of an Andalus type way of speaking. But then if I'm speaking to somebody and I want to try and speak clearly, I will try and speak in a more Castilian manner. But it feels a bit forced. And the more natural way for me to speak Spanish is definitely sin lo ese, hablando así en plan. So it definitely is more towards the Andalus.
Yeah, I get it. I get you. It's almost too easy in it when you start dropping the S's. To me, like Andalusian Spanish just sounds cooler as well. Do you know? There's a bit of whatever laissez-faire about it, isn't there?
It's kind of, I mean, it just is something that happened. I mean, I didn't, as I say, I didn't necessarily do it. It was just, I found it funny when people used to say to me, you know, they used to make a comparison between if you were to compare Andalusian Spanish to any dialect or variation of English, they always used to compare it to Scouse, which I found quite fun. So I used to think it's the Scouse of Spain, which is kind of nice, really, kind of comforting to me. And so yeah, but I didn't pick it. I don't even try to do that. It's just if it sounds vaguely like that to people's ears, great. If someone says, "Oh no, it doesn't sound," as long as people understand my Spanish, I don't mind. I really don't have a problem with it. But with other languages, I have actively tried to learn a different way of speaking. So with French, I did actively study Quebecois. I actively studied Canadian French to try to speak in, because I was going to spend a month in Montreal and I wanted to learn and study it as its own thing, right? So I learned things like, you know, tu sais que je parle québécois. And I know it's not perfect, and the Quebecois speakers, please forgive me, but I learned it genuinely as a sign of respect for going to the country to speak to people and to understand it better and to understand the bits behind it instead of just going as somebody who spoke French. It's not my natural way of speaking French, but I genuinely made an effort to try and speak that way. The same happened when I went to Brazil. I'd studied Portuguese from Portugal, and then when I went to Brazil, I spent a month or two in trying to speak more like a Brazilian speaker of Portuguese and opening up my vowels a lot more and pronouncing it more in a Brazilian manner. It's not perfect, but it ended up being a sort of mid-Atlantic thing that I speak now.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Like a crossbreed of accents. Yeah. Listen, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. It's been so cool chatting. And as we were talking about different languages, then I was kind of thinking, oh God, we could do an hour just romanticizing about French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian. I've only got 6 languages. Do you speak Indonesian or Malay?
Sedikit bahasa Indonesia.
Ah, okay. Awak cakap bahasa Indonesia.
Saya sudah belajar bahasa Indonesia di Bali
Ah, okay.
dengan orang di sana.
Aha.
Yeah.
Very good. So those are the only languages I could kind of go into with you. But I was just thinking, oh yeah, we could go off on one. So thank you so much for chatting with me today. Have you got any like places people can find you or things you want them to know about, like the conference coming up? And
Sure. I mean, so the Polyglot conference, we're going to have an online version, which is the global event, which is between the 4th and the 8th of October. And then the 27th, 28th of October is in person in Budapest. And you can just go to polyglotconference.com to find out more and get tickets. The place to find me is Speaking Fluently, and it's basically on most social media platforms. So yeah, if you go to speakingfluently.com, you'll find all of my social media links in there.
excellent. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure chatting.
Pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for having me.
I hope to speak again.
Yeah,
Thank
me
you.
too. Take care.